Honorable Don McGahn, interviewed by the President of Hillsdale College, Dr. Larry Arnn.
That's your favorite song? Is that your favorite song?
No, I didn't pick it. I didn't pick the tune.
Hello. If you're here and you think America might be in trouble, you probably think the most important man in America is Donald Trump, and I think that. But very high on the list after him would be his White House counsel, Don McGahn, who's doing some of the most interesting and important things in the administration. And we're going to start by Don telling us what a White House counsel is.
Sure. The counsel to the president is an appointed position directly answerable to the president. It is not a career spot. I am appointed by President Trump. The White House counsel's office has existed since about 1943. It is the primary legal advisor to the president, where I advise the president on a range of issues from constitutional law, executive power, whether or not we can go to war, judicial selection, administrative law, essentially government law that the president has to encounter on a day-to-day basis.
And that involves you in just about everything.
Unfortunately, yes.
Yeah. Hard for you to say I didn't do it. So one of the best things about the Trump administration has been the number of judges it's got confirmed and the quality of them. What do you have to do with that?
Well, I guess I'd say I'm the primary advisor to the president on that, and try to give the president advice, my best advice and counsel on who he should nominate. Under the Constitution, the power of nomination is vested with the president expressly in the Constitution. But he cannot simply appoint judges. He has to go through the Senate. It's got the advice and consent clause. So with the advice and consent of the Senate, he can then appoint judges. So it's a time-consuming process. I'm the one who handles the Senate contact mostly. The Senate over time has required quite a bit of consultation with them on judges. So it's not the sort of thing the president can merely do on his own. It's a team effort between the president and the Senate. And I'm the one that has to walk into the Oval Office and advise the president on various recommendations. Ultimately, he makes every decision. He's very engaged in it. He ran on the idea of the judicial branch needing some help. He's delivered on those promises, and I'm really honored to be the person who's most involved in it at the staff level.
What do you look for in a judge?
Well, what the president looks for first are people with excellent credentials, the right sort of temperament, the usual things you hear. But what the president likes are folks who have demonstrated some sort of courage, some sort of ability to stand strong in the face of adversity. People who you know when they get on the bench, they will not change and turn into someone else. What I do in my analysis before I bring it to the president is look for precisely the qualities I know the president wants. And we look for things in a person's background that actually demonstrate that they have a commitment to the notion of a rule of law, meaning that there are standards that are set forth, preferably in legislation enacted by the elected representatives of the people, and whether they're going to give that full measure or are they going to be inclined to create the law on their own. Are they going to stand strong in the face of public criticism? Are they going to respond to the editorial pages, or are they going to read the law as written? Oftentimes, you can get a sense of a person through an interview process of how strong they're going to be or how strong they're not going to be. Sometimes someone looks wonderful on paper, but in actual practice, you get a sense that they're not going to follow through. Other folks look very good on paper, but you get a sense they really have some fortitude. So the president really looks for folks who, not surprisingly, have demonstrated the ability to stand strong, as he has his whole life. So he kind of looks for folks that he can relate to that way.
So there's two things happening, and I wonder if they're coincidental. One is there's a major effort in the Trump administration, coherent and strategic and articulated, to try to do something about reining in the regulatory state. And Justice Gorsuch is an expert on those kinds of issues and the Chevron doctrine. Talk about that.
Well, it's not a coincidence. It's part of a larger plan, I suppose. Justice Gorsuch is, I think, going to be a tremendous justice. It's been an honor to get to know him in the process of the president selecting him to be on the Supreme Court. The thing that did stand out in his record, as you note, is his track record on speaking about administrative law. You mentioned Chevron, sort of explain, if people have heard this idea of Chevron Deference. What that is a reference to a Supreme Court case from 1984, which is the case often cited by courts to give deference to unelected agencies' determinations as to what the law is. In other words, there's a statute, in theory a statute, and then the regulations passed, and is that regulation consistent or not with the statute? I'm oversimplifying it, but what has happened over time is courts are increasingly deferential to the unelected agencies when it comes to making the law. Of course, the legislative power is vested in the legislature under Article 1 of the Constitution, not in unelected agency heads. Justice Gorsuch, when he was on the 10th Circuit, Judge Gorsuch wrote a very, very important concurring opinion on the idea of Chevron deference, asking whether or not it's constitutional. And a very, very well-written opinion cited by many, certainly his standout opinion at the 10th Circuit. And his view was that courts ought not defer to unelected agency heads. It's for the courts to say what the law is. It's for the legislature to pass the law. It's for the executive to enforce the law. And what really resonated with the president was here was a person with impeccable credentials, wonderful character, great man, but frankly stuck his neck out on an issue that anyone else would fear may hurt their chances of promotion to the higher court. But Judge Gorsuch is not that kind of person. And he is sort of leading the vanguard on this. And you see this catching on more and more. There was a time not long ago where no one really spoke of administrative law or the administrative state or whatever one wants to call it. And now you see more and more legal conferences on this. The Federalist Society had their annual lawyers conference last year. The whole topic was administrative law. So this is something that the president has a great focus on curbing the unelected from the idea of overregulation. If one looks at the amount of regulation that we've had passed over the years, if one does a visual, the amount of regulation in the 1960s was maybe this much, and now it fills warehouses of things. And at a certain point, one needs to say enough is enough. So there is definitely a focus on that. On the judicial piece, not only now Justice Gorsuch, but other judges, one of the things we interview on is their views on administrative law. And what you're seeing is the president nominating a number of people who have some experience, if not expertise, in dealing with the government, particularly the regulatory apparatus. This is different than judicial selection in past years. Perhaps there were single-issue litmus tests and that kind of thing. This president is looking for a well-rounded, holistic person who really understands separation of powers, the role of the regulatory state, the role of the legislature and the executive. So there is a coherent plan here where actually the judicial selection and the deregulatory effort are really the flip side of the same coin.
So one would think Congress would have a huge stake in this because Article 1 starts out all the legislative powers herein granted. And that's interesting because Article 2 about the president and Article 3 about the judges don't have that word all. But now 20 times, I think, is the amount of the laws that are made in America are made in the bureaucracy. And in fact, since the number of laws passed by the Congress in the last 100 years has not really changed, that's what makes big government possible. What do you think can be done about that? What should Congress do, and what can the executive branch do?
Well, with Congress, this is not something that happened overnight. This has been happening for decades and decades and decades. So you cannot really get particularly mad at any particular member of Congress. But there's safety in numbers, I suppose, on that. What has happened is over time, Congress has passed broad sweeping statutes that are not particularly detailed. They give broad power to administrative agencies. The EPA, for example, is told to make the air clean and the water clean. Well, there's not a lot of detail on that, which leaves the bureaucracy to fashion what would otherwise be thought of as legislation. Congress used to legislate more. They don't seem to legislate much anymore. They tend to do broader statutes that abdicate, frankly, the legislative power. And again, this is not a recent thing. This has been building up for decades and decades and decades. It really goes back to probably Woodrow Wilson, probably a little bit before, the idea of having sort of unelected experts make the big decisions, getting politics out of the political decisions. Not really the way it's supposed to work in our country. You're supposed to have elected representatives who pass the laws and are accountable. Which brings me to the next thing Congress can do, in addition to, wasn't intended to be an applause line, but thank you for the three in the front. It's dry stuff, I know. Shout out to stage left. So the first thing, Congress could legislate and actually focus on the meaning of the words. I ran a federal agency once upon a time, and I had met with another agency head who came to have lunch with me and get some tips on how to run agencies. And she was a former member of Congress, and she said if she knew then, when she was in Congress, what she knew as running an agency, it would have completely changed her view on meaning of legislation. Too often, Congress debates various little micro changes in language, and they fight each other to a draw, and each side comes away thinking they won the debate, merely to just take the decision and shift it over to a more unaccountable, unelected branch. It's not really it's kind of its own branch of government now. And then those decisions tend to trend to the left. So when the legislature punts, the gap gets filled in a way that usually is not in the favor of liberty. So the first thing would be for Congress to pay attention more to the details of legislation. Second, oversight is very important. Congress does have power to police its legislation and to conduct oversight on how its legislation is actually working out. They ought to do that. It's counterintuitive for the counsel to the president of Executive One to encourage the Congress to do oversight, but they ought to do that. They ought to really roll up their sleeves and see how this legislation works out, not just do the sort of oversight that gets headlines, but do oversight that really gets into the nitty-gritty of how laws are being implemented, and it gives them the tools they need to perhaps change laws. There's a number of statutes that have been on the books for years and years and years, and they continue to sort of proceed apace without much in the way of review. Periodically, Congress ought to take a hard look at some of these major pieces of legislation and see if they're still working as intended. Chances are they're not. They've gotten well beyond what Congress originally thought they were doing. And the third thing Congress can do is to read, with all due respect, read the Constitution and realize that there are powers that belong to the Congress and the Congress only. There are enumerated powers. The executive branch really doesn't have enumerated powers. All executive authority is vested in the president. It makes my job a little more challenging. I don't have a list of enumerated powers I can look to when I advise the president on what he can and can't do. It's a more general executive power. Congress sometimes wants to do executive kind of things, sometimes judicial things. Judges seem to want to fill in gaps and write a little law. The executive branch wants to write a little law. What Congress can do is to try to join us in an effort to try to reframe who does what in a way much more consistent with the original text and meaning of the Constitution. There's three branches for a reason. The president is committed to this. He ran on this. I mean, when President Trump as a candidate talked about judicial selection, this was a shorthand for the idea of rule of law and the constitutional order and getting us back to basics. He did it very effectively, and that's what he's doing. There's so much that's going on you don't read about in the mainstream media on this, but there's so much good work going on trying to restore us back to the fundamentals, and thus accountability to the people, precisely the kind of people that elected President Trump to do what he's doing now.
It's remarkable to me. There's a promise that you'll repeal 2 regulations for every 1 passed. The ratio is better than that, right?
Way better, yes.
Way better.
Yeah.
And
that's how President Trump does things. He always he overshoots the expectation. There's an what you're talking about, executive order. President wanted this out of the gate, and one of the things I do is help draft these executive orders. So I'm the scribe sometimes in the back room writing this up. But it's an executive order specifically on regulatory review and fundamental change. And one of the aspects of this you mentioned is this idea of 2 for 1. And the executive order directs executive branch agencies when it comes to making regulations. For every new regulation, you need to remove 2 from the books. So you don't have this constant piling up of regulations on top of regulations. We've done some numbers on this. Apparently the ratio is 22 to 1, so it's been wildly successful. We're very proud of that. There was a number of regulations passed in the last year or two of the previous administration, quite hastily, and a lot of what's been removed from the books are those regulations. So that's just the beginning. There's also something called the Congressional Review Act, which Congress has used for the first time in the first year of administration. There have been a couple examples where they've done this, but this is a law that allows Congress to essentially veto regulations. Part of the deal is when they cede their legislative power to the executive, they had to have a final say under this statute. And Congress rightly struck a number of regulations, and we hope that they continue to do that. So the 2-to-1 comes from an executive order, and it shows that how much the president is committed to cutting through the red tape and getting back to the more familiar structure that our founders and previous generations had if one were to rely on the Constitution.
So I think we have to close, but congratulations and thank you. Fabulous year.
Thank you.